South Africa's infamous honeymoon nightmare, Annie Dewani's tragic tale. In the heart of South Africa, a honeymoon turned into a nightmare. Annie Dewani's body was found in the back of a taxi, a tragic end to what should have been a joyous occasion. What seemed like a random carjacking spiraled into a high-profile case, leaving many to question. Was her husband, Shrien Dewani, truly innocent, or was there something darker beneath the surface? The truth remains clouded in mystery. What really happened that night? Could the answers be more chilling than we ever imagined? November 13th, 2010. It should have been the start of a perfect honeymoon for Annie Dewani and her husband Shrien. They had just flown into Cape Town, South Africa, eager to begin their adventure together. The air was warm, the city buzzing with excitement, and the couple was in high spirits. Shrien, ever the planner, had arranged everything. Their time in Cape Town was meant to be magical. After arriving at their luxurious hotel, they settled in and began their sightseeing. It was a beautiful day, one filled with laughter and joy as they explored the city together. Shrien and Annie were enjoying each other's company, marveling at the landscapes and the beauty of the place. But as the sun began to set, the night would take a dark turn. Around 7:30 p.m., Shrien and Annie stepped into a local taxi driven by Zola Tongo, who had been hired to give them a tour of the city. Tongo was friendly, and the couple felt comfortable with him. They decided to make the most of their night and see parts of Cape Town that tourists don't often visit. Shrien wanted to show Annie the real South Africa, the vibrant culture that lay beyond the typical tourist spots. They stopped for dinner at a popular restaurant, enjoying a meal and talking about their future. The night felt full of promise, but soon they were back in the taxi, continuing their journey. Shrien had Tongo drive them through the townships of Cape Town, including the notorious Gugulethu, known for its high crime rate. It was a dangerous area after dark, but Annie seemed curious, wanting to see a side of the city few ever did. At around 10:30 p.m., everything changed. Tongo stopped the car at a street intersection. Suddenly, two armed men appeared out of nowhere. They rushed to the taxi, banging on the windows with guns drawn. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Shrien and Annie were terrified, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Zola Tongo, the taxi driver, was thrown out of the car as the attackers took control. The men demanded their valuables, and in a panic, Shrien handed over his wallet, his designer watch, and his phone. Annie, too, was robbed of her jewelry. The violence of it all was overwhelming, but the attackers didn't stop there. They didn't just want their possessions, they wanted to take Annie's life. The two men continued to hold Annie hostage in the back of the taxi, while Shrien was thrown out onto the street. Shrien, in shock, stumbled to a nearby house, desperately asking for help. "My wife's been taken. I need to report a carjacking," he pleaded. But what had started as a robbery soon turned into something much more horrifying. Annie's life was about to be stolen from her. The next morning, the police received a call. It came from a resident in the Khayelitsha area, about a 20-minute drive from Gugulethu. The caller had noticed a car parked on the side of the road all night. When the police arrived at the scene, they made a gruesome discovery. Inside the Volkswagen Chiron, the same taxi Annie and Shrien had been in, lay Annie's lifeless body. She had been shot once point blank in the neck. The gunshot wound was brutal, and forensic experts confirmed that it had been the cause of her death. Annie had bled out. There were no signs of struggle beyond the bruises on her body, but the scene itself told a chilling story. The car was abandoned, and her body was discarded like a forgotten item. Annie's watch, phone, and jewelry had all been stolen. At first, the police thought this was just another carjacking gone wrong, but as the investigation unfolded, a deeper suspicion began to grow. Why was Annie targeted like this? Was it really a random attack? And why had the criminals let Shrien go free but took Annie's life? The police began to focus on the details. Shrien's account of the night's events was strange. He seemed confused about certain facts. Why had he not mentioned that his wife's valuables had been taken until later? Why were there inconsistencies in his story? His behavior didn't add up, and it raised alarms. But it wasn't just Shrien's story that was under scrutiny. The taxi driver, Zola Tongo, who had been so helpful at first, seemed to be hiding something. He had witnessed the carjacking firsthand, yet his story didn't quite match the evidence. Why had he not been able to help identify the attackers? Was he truly an innocent bystander, or was he somehow involved in Annie's death? The police started looking into Zola Tongo's background. What they discovered would send shockwaves through the investigation. The case was no longer just about a tragic carjacking. It was about a possible murder plot. The more the authorities uncovered, the more it seemed like something was very wrong. But who was behind it all? Before we continue, if you're captivated by unraveling, chilling mysteries and delving into real-life crime stories, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps us bring more cases into the spotlight. Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell, so you're always in the loop. You never know which mystery we'll crack next. And trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. And if you know someone as obsessed with true crime as you are, share this video, because some mysteries deserve more attention. And together, we can uncover the truth. The investigation took a dramatic turn as the police zeroed in on Zola Tongo. Days after the crime, Tongo was arrested, and under questioning, he made a shocking confession. He admitted that the attack wasn't random, that it had been orchestrated. But the most startling part of his story was who he claimed had planned it. Tongo said that Shrien Dewani, Annie's husband, was behind the entire plot. Tongo's confession was chilling. He said Shrien had paid him to stage the carjacking and that the murder was planned. Tongo's words didn't just implicate him, they pointed directly at Shrien. Was Shrien really the mastermind behind his wife's death? The idea seemed unfathomable to many, but the police were determined to find out. Tongo's confession was followed by the arrest of two other men, Mziwa Madoda Kwabi and Zolile Mngeni. Both men had been involved in the hijacking. They too pointed to Shrien as the person who had orchestrated the murder. Their testimonies, combined with phone records and CCTV footage, seemed to confirm Tongo's account. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But was this all just a ploy to cover their tracks? Could they be lying to save themselves from a life sentence? The police had to dig deeper. They needed concrete proof. But with each confession, the story seemed to grow darker. Was Shrien really guilty, or were these men simply using his name to escape the consequences of their actions? The case took another twist as the police uncovered phone records that linked Shrien to Tongo on the night of the murder. The evidence seemed to suggest that Shrien had been in contact with Tongo multiple times leading up to the crime. Was this just a coincidence, or did it point to a premeditated plan? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there was more to this case than met the eye. Annie Dewani's life had been cut short, and the question on everyone's mind was, who was genuinely responsible for her death? Was it the criminals who carried out the murder, or was it her husband, Shrien Dewani, who had pulled the strings from the shadows? The case was far from over, and the answers were still elusive. The truth behind Annie's tragic death would continue to unfold, with each new twist and turn leaving the world more shocked and confused than ever. The investigation was just beginning, but one thing was clear: the road to justice would be anything but easy. As the investigation deepened, the prosecutors began to build their case against Shrien Dewani. The charges were serious. He was accused of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, robbery with aggravating circumstances, murder, and obstruction of justice. The prosecution claimed that Shrien had carefully planned his wife's murder, using the men around him to carry out his dirty work. CCTV footage also showed Shrien and Tongo meeting in secret, exchanging something in private. What was it? Was it money? Was it a final confirmation of the plan? The footage seemed to suggest that Shrien was directly involved. But the prosecution didn't stop there. They also explored Shrien's possible motives for wanting his wife dead. Was it a simple case of greed, or was there something more sinister at play? The prosecutors suggested that Shrien's hidden sexuality could have played a role. There were rumors swirling around Shrien's personal life. Some claimed that he was bisexual and had been involved in relationships with other men. Could his marriage to Annie have been a sham, a cover for his secret life? Did he kill her to escape a marriage he never truly wanted? The courtroom drama reached its peak as the prosecution presented evidence that seemed to back up their claims. Shrien's defense team, however, was quick to deny everything. They argued that the confessions from Tongo, Kwabe, and Mingani were unreliable and tainted by lies. They insisted that Shrien was innocent, that he had no involvement in the crime, and that he was the victim of a setup. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. They argued that Shrien had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to kill his wife. The evidence seemed to paint a clear picture of a man who had carefully plotted his wife's death. The prosecution also brought in expert witnesses who analyzed the forensic evidence. They testified that the gunshot that killed Annie was a deliberate act, not a random robbery gone wrong. The autopsy confirmed that Annie had been shot at close range, and the gunshot wound was consistent with a planned execution. This, combined with the confessions and the evidence tying Shrien to the crime, made the case against him stronger than ever. As the trial went on, it became clear that this was no simple case. There were twists and turns at every corner. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of damning evidence. But there were still questions. Was Shrien truly the mastermind, or was he a victim of a miscarriage of justice? The courtroom was tense, and the stakes were high. Would Shrien be convicted, or would the truth remain hidden behind a veil of confusion and doubt? One thing was sure, Annie's murder was not the random act of violence it had once seemed. There were dark forces at play, and the search for the truth was just beginning. As the jury listened to the evidence, they were left to decide if Shrien Dewani was the man responsible for his wife's tragic death, or if someone else was behind the wheel of this twisted plot. When Shrien Dewani faced accusations of orchestrating the murder of his wife Annie during their honeymoon in South Africa, his defense strategy was clear. He was innocent, and the allegations against him were baseless. His team painted him as a man wrongfully accused of the most heinous crime, with no plausible motive behind the allegations. They pointed to his grief and the emotional wreckage he experienced following Annie's tragic death. Shrien's supporters rallied behind him, vehemently denying any wrongdoing. They argued that the idea of Shrien planning his wife's murder was ludicrous. After all, why would a man who had celebrated their wedding in India just weeks before the tragedy arrange her death in such a brutal manner? The defense team brought to light Shrien's emotional breakdown, his struggles with PTSD, and his ongoing battle with depression. They argued that there were clear signs that he was a victim of circumstance, not the mastermind behind Annie's murder. Shrien, who had been a successful businessman, was described as deeply affected by the traumatic events he had witnessed. According to his lawyers, he was a man in deep shock, struggling to cope with the loss of his wife under such mysterious and tragic circumstances. Moreover, Shrien's defense team contended that the case against him was based on questionable evidence, mostly the shaky testimonies of the convicted men involved in the crime, who had changed their stories multiple times. They accused the prosecution of relying on unreliable and inconsistent witnesses whose confessions were riddled with contradictions. Shrien's defense insisted that the charges against him were the result of a botched investigation, with law enforcement jumping to conclusions in a high-profile case where the actual perpetrators were left unaccounted for. As the trial unfolded, several alternative theories emerged regarding Annie Dewani's death. One prominent theory suggested that the murder was not part of a well-planned conspiracy, but rather the result of a botched carjacking. According to this narrative, the hijackers initially intended to rob the couple, but ended up killing Annie when the situation spun out of control. This theory suggested that the hijackers acted on impulse, and what was supposed to be a random crime quickly escalated into a tragic murder. This alternative theory seemed to fit with the initial details of the case. The hijackers, who had approached the vehicle armed, had forced Shrien and Annie out of the car, taking their valuables. However, things went wrong when they tried to remove Annie from the car. The hijackers shot her, likely in the course of a struggle. Evidence from the crime scene, including the gunshot wound, suggested that she had fought back. The forensic evidence presented in the trial further complicated matters, leaving everyone involved with more questions than answers. Experts testified that Annie had been shot at close range, with the bullet passing through her hand and into her neck, severing an artery. The details of the shooting indicated that Annie had tried to defend herself before she was fatally injured. Forensic experts also pointed to the fact that no signs of sexual assault were found, despite initial speculation that there may have been a different motive for her death. However, the defense team was quick to cast doubt on the forensic evidence. They pointed out that there were irregularities in how evidence had been handled, with key pieces of information going missing or being mishandled during the investigation. For example, police notebooks containing critical notes about the case were inexplicably lost. This raised concerns about the integrity of the investigation. The defense argued that these lapses in procedure undermine the credibility of the entire case against Shreen. Despite these concerns, the prosecution pushed forward with its case, insisting that Shreen had arranged the murder as part of a hit plot. They argued that Shreen's motives were likely financial or related to his hidden sexuality, which some speculated he had tried to conceal. According to the prosecution, Shreen's possible desire to collect insurance money and escape his marriage to Annie provided a compelling reason for him to have orchestrated her death. As the trial continued, emotions ran high, and tensions in the courtroom reached a boiling point. The prosecution presented a case that portrayed Shreen as a cold, calculating individual who had manipulated those around him for his own personal gain. They painted a picture of a man who had used his wealth and influence to arrange the murder of his wife, hiding behind a web of lies and deceit. On the other hand, the defense sought to depict Shreen as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been thrust into a nightmare that no one could have anticipated. They argued that Shreen had no reason to murder Annie, a woman he had married out of love and who had been his partner in a genuine relationship. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the question of Shreen's guilt or innocence would remain a contentious issue for years to come. Would the prosecution's case hold up under scrutiny, or was Shreen truly the victim of a miscarriage of justice? In the end, the court's decision would hinge not only on the inconsistencies in witness testimony, but also on the credibility of the forensic evidence. This case would go down in history as one of the most puzzling and emotionally charged trials of the decade. In December 2014, Shreen Dewani was acquitted of all charges in one of the most gripping trials South Africa had ever seen. The courtroom was filled with drama as Shreen stood accused of orchestrating the murder of his wife. Judge Jeanette Traverso, in her final ruling, acknowledged the numerous inconsistencies and the lack of credible evidence, ultimately deciding that Shreen Dewani should be acquitted. The courtroom was left stunned. No clear answers had been found, leaving the case shrouded in mystery. Was Shreen truly innocent, or had he managed to escape justice? The question haunted everyone, especially Annie's family. Annie's family was devastated. The emotional toll of the trial had already been unbearable, but the acquittal was a bitter blow. They had watched as the man they once considered family stood trial for the murder of their beloved Annie. With the acquittal, the wounds deepened. They felt betrayed by the justice system, and the truth they so desperately sought seemed further out of reach than ever. The family's grief turned into frustration as they continued to search for answers, refusing to let Annie's death remain unsolved. They voiced their anger, demanding justice and clarity, even after the trial was over. For them, the case was not just about a crime, it was about finding peace for Annie, and the questions surrounding her death were far from answered. So, was Shreen Dewani wrongfully accused, or did he get away with murder? What's your theory on what really happened that night in Cape Town? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth stories on unsolved mysteries.